What's happening, guys? Today we're going to be starting a new video series on this channel where I am editing subscriber photos and sharing different techniques and things that you can use and apply into your own workflows. Now, this is something that I posted about the other day on my YouTube community page, and then I also posted about it on my Instagram story, and I made a call out for anyone who is interested to send me their photos to be a part of this video series. So a whole bunch of people sent me their images, and I really appreciate everybody who sent me their photos and wanted to be a part of this video series. Of course, I couldn't get to everybody, so I picked one for this episode, and that is, of course, the image sitting on the computer right behind me. I got the before and after sitting over there. The image that we're going to be working with today is an image by Francesca Ravelli. If you want to check out her Instagram, I'll leave a link down in that description below so you can check out her work, show her some love and all that good stuff. So today we're going to be editing this really beautiful portrait that Francesca shot, and we're going to be going over a bunch of things from the overall workflow that I like to use in Photoshop, the steps for editing a portrait. We're going to do a bunch of retouching with the skin, some cool stuff with our clone stamp tool, and then we're going to go all in those color adjustments, sharpening, and all that fun stuff. So now, with all of that being said, let's hop into Photoshop and start editing this image. The reason that I picked this photo is because I really like the composition of this photo. I like how her face is kind of held within like the curve of this foam. There's really nice light and dark, and also it's like kind of looks like this almost high fashion fragrance ad sort of photo. So I was really into it, and it's totally different than the things that I usually edit on this channel. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to dive into portrait editing and touching up skin and that kind of thing. So unfortunately, unlike my other tutorials, I'm not going to be able to include a download link to this photo just because this obviously is not my photo, so I can't do whatever I want with it. However, the whole point of this is to be able to share new ideas and techniques that I maybe haven't talked about in other tutorials, or maybe kind of blending everything together and putting them to actual use. And that's sort of the purpose of this series. It's not necessarily that you can practice editing one of these photos, it's that you guys can get a better look at how I go about editing my photos and maybe some techniques that you might end up incorporating into your own work. Now, one final thing before we get started is we're going to be talking about a lot of different things today, so I'm not going to necessarily be going in depth about each thing I talk about. I'm just going to be kind of going through the steps, and you'll be seeing the changes that are being made. I'll explain how to do them, but I'm not going to be necessarily spending a whole bunch of time on individual steps. If you have any questions about a certain step, let me know in the comments below, and you might see it in another tutorial or a blog post later on. So now the first thing I'm going to do when I bring an image into Photoshop is I usually go into Camera Raw, so just to do my basic color adjustments and things like that. So I'm going to unlock this layer 0, and I'm going to right click and convert it to a smart object. By converting this layer to a smart object, I can now go into Camera Raw, and then I will be able to adjust those settings later if I want to. I just like to have the option. So I'm going to press Command or Control Shift and A to open Camera Raw. And now this little window comes up. If you guys aren't familiar with Camera Raw, it's pretty much like Lightroom. It has all these different tabs here to do your editing and whatnot. So in here I'll do like a little bit of color temperature adjustments, maybe a little bit with like exposure and things like that. But this image, as you can even see by this histogram, this image is super well exposed. It's really nice. So there's not really a whole lot that we have to change. It's more just like artistic changes. There's no like basic corrections that we have to do in the case of this photo. So I'm just going to start with bringing up my color temperature just a little, just to make this a little bit more warmer. And then it's kind of green, so I might just add a little bit more magenta just to kind of balance it out. One thing, if you're ever looking at your photo and it feels like a little too much of one color, to kind of get rid of that, you just have to counteract it by adding the opposite color. So in this case, it felt a little green, so I added a bit of magenta, and now it feels a lot better to me. Now, I'm going to go into my curves. Even though I will be doing a curves adjustment layer later on, I do like to do a little bit of basic stuff within Camera Raw as well. I usually end up bringing the highlights and the lights up just a little bit. And then sometimes I bring down the shadows. As you guys have probably seen with the stuff I post on Instagram, I do typically like a lot of contrast. But what I find with portraits, especially with female portraits, is you want it to look soft and sort of welcoming more so. So I find that contrast kind of takes away from that. So in the case of more feminine photos, I like to sort of lessen the contrast. So in that case, I'm bringing all my values up just a little bit. Now I might just go quickly into my HSL adjustments, which is just hue, saturation, and luminance. And so I'm just going to maybe play around with the hue of the water a little bit. I don't want it to be too teal like that, but I want it to still look realistic. but maybe just add a little bit of that purple color, and then I might actually just desaturate it a little bit as well. Now her skin color and all that stuff I'm pretty happy with. Again, we're going to be going and doing a lot of those other adjustments afterwards. This is just sort of the original touch-ups, the basic things that we need to accomplish. The other thing that I might do is I could lighten her face just a little, so I'll grab my adjustment brush here, and you can just adjust the brush size with your bracket keys just like the normal brush tool in Photoshop. And I'm just going to go around her face and kind of on her skin here, and making sure that my feather is nice and high. I can set my feather down here. I have a 100% feather, so all these adjustments are going to be really soft. So I can just bring that up just a little bit just to kind of make her pop a little bit more. So that looks pretty fine to me there. And then I can review the before and after by pressing Q on my keyboard. And then so as you see, we have before and after. I like to just review it just to see if there's anything from the original that I liked more, and so in this case I almost like it to be a little bit cooler, so I am just going to bring down my color temperature slider a little, and I'm going to dip a little bit more into the blue. So I'm now at -1 blue, so now this is just a little bit more blue than this one. So now we have done some very basic adjustments. I'm pretty happy with this, so I'm going to click OK, and that's going to load it into my image, and now you can see that because we converted our layer to a smart object, we now have the option to double click on our camera raw filter and adjust things after the fact as we wish. Now that's just sort of a backup. Worst case scenario, we need to go back and do something in camera raw, we can go back to this layer, but I'm going to duplicate this layer and I'm going to rasterize it so it just becomes a normal layer now. And so if everything goes wrong, I'm going to go back to this layer, but I'm mostly going to be working with this newly duplicated layer that I'm just going to call to girl. Now the first things that I'll do the second I'm editing a portrait is I'm going to first do those camera raw adjustments, and then I'm going to jump into some touch-ups within the skin and whatnot. So I'm going to do all that on a new layer because I don't want to directly affect and permanently edit this layer. So I'm just zooming in here, and I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll just call this one to adjustments. I'm going to be a little bit more nitpicky than you maybe have to be. It doesn't really matter the sort of touch-ups that you do, because especially in the case of this photo, her skin is already really nice. There's not a whole lot that we have to touch up, but there is a difference between sort of a natural look and then sort of the edit that you can get in Photoshop. So it depends what you want to do, and if you want to make it look a little bit more processed or a little bit more commercial looking, I guess you could say. But just because we are learning here, I'm going to go all in and we're going to touch up her face completely. So, but within reason. We don't want to make her look fake, of course. So the first thing is that her teeth have a little bit of this indent here, and obviously it's not a big deal. It is part of her, but if you say you want to fill in that gap, it's really easy to do actually. So I'm going to grab my pen tool and I'm going to just zoom in on her mouth here, and I'm going to just basically make 2 anchor points across my teeth to fill in that missing piece, I guess. So I'm just going to go around like so, and then I'm going to right click and go to make selection, and then making sure my feather radius is about 0.5 pixels so it sort of matches the edge of the teeth right now, and I'm going to click OK. Now I have this selection that I can only paint inside of that selection with, so I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool by pressing S. I'm going to sample sort of in the darker area of her tooth, and I'm now going to just paint over in that area like so, filling in that gap. And so because we have the selection, we can't paint outside of that selection. We can only paint within the parameters of our selection. So that's why I set it so then I can't go over the edge of the tooth or something like that. Because I'm painting it on a new layer, I have to make sure my sample is set to current and below. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to paint onto a transparent layer. But because it's set to current and below, I can do adjustments onto this girl layer. I'm going to press Command D to deselect that, and now that tooth is nicely filled in. And if you feel really confident, you can just sample and sort of hand paint it like this, like I'm going to try to do with this other tooth here, but it's really up to you. In my case, it really helps because I am using an editing tablet. If you're not familiar with editing tablets, they just help to dial in how precise your brush strokes are and whatnot, but that's sort of the gist of what they do, and they really help with portrait editing and editing in Photoshop for that matter. But now we have filled in the teeth, and I would just turn that on and off. You can see that you can't even tell the difference, especially when you zoom all the way out here, turn it on, and now her teeth are filled in. You would never know any different. Now, on this same layer, because we're just touching her whole face up in one layer here, I'm just going to dive into doing more adjustments and touching up her face all on the same layer. So the tool that I often like to use, just because it's really nice and easy, is my spot healing brush tool. The thing to keep in mind when you're editing people's faces or removing blemishes is you don't want to remove things that make the person who they are. So for example, like freckles or a scar or things on their face that are always going to be there. You just have to be mindful of what you're taking away and what you're not, because you still want the model to look like the same person. So with the spot healing brush tool, we can literally just click over an area like so, and I'm just going to try to get rid of some of this discoloration here, and it just makes that selection with the black, and then it automatically fills it in. I'm also going to just get rid of these piercing holes on her ear. Then there's a little bit under her lip. You can be as meticulous as you want with this, or you cannot do it at all. It's really up to you. I like to do this just because I'm kind of OCD about this stuff. But again, I'm just going through all this stuff just to show you exactly the steps and whatnot that I would go through when editing a portrait in Photoshop. Alright, so now we're zoomed out. I'm going to just turn this layer on and off. You can see the little bit of a difference that we made now. So we've filled in her teeth, we've taken away a few of the spots and things like that, but her skin is already really nice, so there wasn't a lot of cleaning up to do. Now that we have done those adjustments, we're going to do a little bit of frequency separation, and so that's just to smooth out any of the blotchiness in the skin. So her skin already doesn't look very blotchy, but trust me, when you add a bit of frequency separation, it makes a humongous difference. So I'm just going to first group all of these layers by shift clicking all those layers and pressing Command or Control G, and I'm going to just call this to breakdown. So this is all the layers that basically are making up my image currently, and if I need to go back, these are what I'm going to go to. So I'm going to first duplicate this group by pressing Command or Control J, and then I'm going to merge that group by pressing Command or Control E. Now that group is just merged onto one singular layer here, and I'm going to duplicate that layer so I have two breakdown copies. I'm going to name the bottom one to blur and the top one to texture. I'm going to turn off my texture layer, select my blur layer, and I'm going to go and select my Gaussian blur. So you go to access your Gaussian blur, you go filter, blur, and Gaussian blur, and we want to basically add a blur that makes it so we can still see the details and things that's going on, but we don't want to completely blur it out so we can't even see what we're looking at. We want to be more in the realm that it's smoothing out. It looks as if her skin is completely smooth. We can see the details in her face and whatnot, but she's not completely blurred out. So in this case, I think around a 7 pixel radius is looking pretty good. So I'm going to click OK, and then I'm next going to go to my texture layer, turn that layer on. I'm going to go up here to image, apply image, and then I'm going to first change my layer selection to blur. So now it's going to be basing this information off of my blur layer. I'm going to change my blending mode from normal to subtract, and making sure my scale is set to 2 and my offset set to 128. Your image should look like this, gray with a bunch of it looks like super sharp, but in a gray image. Once you have this done, you're going to click OK, and with that texture layer selected, we're going to change our blending mode from normal down here to linear light. So now if I turn these on and off, absolutely nothing has happened, and basically what we have done with these two layers is we have separated the texture of her skin and the color of her skin, or the hues of her skin. So now we can go onto our blur layer and we can selectively start to blur areas of her skin without removing any of the texture. So that's what frequency separation is. The tool that we're going to be using is our lasso tool. You can access that by pressing L on your keyboard, and we're going to make sure that our feather up here is set to about 10 pixels. That's what I like to end up using, but it's really up to you. You just want to have a nice pixel radius so there's no harsh edges going on, and we're basically going to select blotchy areas on her face, so like these shadowy areas or anything that's like really highlighted or maybe a little red or something. Those are the areas that we're going to go over with frequency separation. So I'm going to first start in her chin. I'm going to do a nice large area around her chin like this, and what you'll typically have to do is go to filter, blur, and Gaussian blur, but as you see, I've set a shortcut to Command Shift and 1 to access my Gaussian blur. You can make your own shortcuts just by going up to edit and down here to keyboard shortcuts, and then you can go in there and type in your own shortcuts for things. I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm just letting you know that I have a shortcut for Gaussian blur, so I'm not going to continue to go up to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I'm just going to be pressing my shortcut of Command Shift 1, and then that brings up my Gaussian blur box, and basically within that selection it's going to blur whatever is in that selection. So as you see, if I bring my radius to 0, it looks like that. If I bring it up, it sort of begins to smooth that out. You don't want to go too crazy with it because then it starts to look weird, but you want to just sort of do a nice job to smooth it without making it look like porcelain, if that makes sense. Click OK, press Command D to deselect that, And we're going to just select another area, and we're just going to be going through like this all over her face. You might have to change the pixel radius occasionally. I like to just adjust it every time, but it's up to you. Gonna work on this little shadowy area on the inside of her eye, just to really smooth that out. It's a bit of this dark area above her eyebrow. And the thing to remember with frequency separation is you don't want to be selecting any area that you want to be sharp. So for example, the hair or something like that, because we don't want to blur out the hair and we don't want the color of the hair to start to seep into the skin color. So you just have to be careful about that, not selecting too close to the edge of something that you don't want to be blurred out, or you don't want the color to leak into your frequency separation. That looks pretty good there. And then areas like around her nose and things like that, because if we made this area really soft, it's going to look like her nose just kind of goes into her face with no sort of crevice or bend or anything, and that would just look really unnatural. So I'm not going to adjust this darker area right now. I'll just access my layers once again. I'm going to group these two just so I can turn them on and off here, and I'm going to turn them on and off, and you can see the pretty subtle but massive difference that it makes in smoothing out her skin tone. So we are still retaining that texture, but we're basically smoothing out any of those shadows or anything that might be going on that's potentially making her face look less smooth than it possibly could be. So that's what frequency separation does. With that group, I'm just going to call this to frequency. And we have all of those frequency adjustments sitting in our group. Now, the next thing I'm going to do in regards to her face is this little area here is a little bit discolored. So I'm going to just grab my brush tool and I'm going to sample this sort of orangey color. So I'm holding Alt to sample, and I'm going to just paint a little bit over her chin like this. And I'm going to change the blending mode from normal down here to color. And then I'm going to just bring the fill down just a little, just to help blend in that color into the skin a little bit better. And then turning that on and off, we've completely got rid of that blue that was sort of on her chin, and it just makes the color on her face look a lot better. So I'm just going to call this to skin color touch up. So now with those two things, we have done a whole bunch, and we are now complete with editing her face and things, so we can now go into the overall adjustments of our photo. So the first thing that I usually consider is, am I okay with the crop of this image? In this case, it does feel like there's a little bit too much headroom, so I'm going to just bring this down so that her eye is sitting in the top left power point of the photo. I like this crop a little bit better. That's a subjective thing, but that's just what I'm going to do for this. Now, the sequence that I like to go about editing my images in is I do any of those close touch-ups first, and then I go and do some exposure adjustments, and then last I do color adjustments. So I'm going to first start with my curves, and like I said, I kind of like to have that softer look. So I'm going to start just down in this very bottom of my curves and bring that up, so it makes the base of my shadows a little bit higher, and it kind of gives it this matte look that I kind of like. I don't want to go too crazy with the highlights in this one just because it's already pretty bright and has some natural contrast there, which is nice. I'm going to bring the curve up a little bit in the shadows here, and that looks fine to me. And then I'm going to go down to my blue, and I'm going to add some blue into the shadows and then bring the yellows down in the highlights just to kind of add this cool look to it. So I'm pretty happy with how that color is looking, so I'm going to leave it there. The next thing I'm going to do is grab my color balance tool. I'm going to go to image, down here to apply image, make sure my layer is set to merge, and change my blending mode from subtract to normal. Click OK, and it basically just applies that image onto our layer mask to just help the colors blend a little better. I have a video explaining that whole process in depth and what it's doing. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description down below. But if you don't really care, just continue watching this video. And so now I'm just going to start in my midtones, and I'm going to continue the work that I just did. So adding a bit of blue and perhaps a bit of red. And then I go to my shadows, add a bit of blue, add a bit of cyan, maybe a touch of green, and then highlights, and add a little more yellow to that. So that looks pretty good to me there. I'll turn that on and off so I can just double check the difference. It's very slight, but there is the difference that I am definitely liking a lot here. So just turn both those layers on and off, and I like the direction that we're going so far, so I'm going to continue with this. I always like to just turn my adjustment layers on and off very frequently, just so I can be very sure that I like what's happening. I'm not making all these adjustments and then after the fact I realize, oh, this looks horrible. So the next thing that I'll go is to my hue saturation here. I'm going to go first to my blues, which is likely going to be the water. Bring my saturation to 100% to see what's being affected. And I'm going to just maybe bring the blue up a little bit in the hue slider, but I'm also going to bring down that saturation a bit and maybe bring up the lightness as well. Something like that. Looks pretty cool. And I'm going to go up to my reds, which is likely her skin. And I don't want to go too overboard with this, but I might just want to make her skin a little bit more saturated, just to kind of bring out that color against the water. That looks pretty good there. And those are the only two colors that I'm really going to adjust in this case. I'm next going to create a new layer, and I'm going to grab a gradient, and I'm going to select a neutral density gradient, which is this bottom one right here. Click OK, and I'm just going to darken this bottom area because I'm a really big fan of having light and dark, and this image already has naturally a really nice area of light coming in here, so I'm just going to add a bit of darkness coming in this way, clicking and dragging just to add that gradient in. And I'm next going to just change the layer blending mode from normal down here to soft light just to kind of make it blend a little better, and I'm going to change the fill just so it's not so aggressive. I'll go all the way to 0, work my way back up until I find something that I like. Something in here looks really nice to me, and I call this to ND grad. And like I said before, I find that because we have darkened this area, it sort of draws our attention to the lighter area of her face, and I just like the look of this. So that's why I added that ND. Next thing I'll do is grab my selective color. I'm going to once again apply my image to that layer mask just to help those colors blend in nicely. Going up, image, apply image. I'm going to start in my blacks here, and I'm just going to maybe bring down that contrast a bit. Add a little bit of blue in there. And a bit of cyan. Go to my neutrals. Bring that down just a hair. Bit of yellow. I go to my whites. This one I'll lighten up a bunch so that I can lighten the foam and stuff that's around here. Then I'll add maybe a little bit of red to it like that. So now turning that on and off. Again, we have some very subtle differences, but they're there, and it's sort of the small steps, the small but noticeable steps in creating your final edit. And so I'll turn all these layers on and off quickly just to see if I like the direction we're going. I am very happy with how this is looking so far. I like the flat, clean, very feminine, and like I kind of said before, it reminds me of like this fragrance ad is kind of just missing a brand name down here, and we'd be good to go. So now the last thing that I typically will do is I'm either going to add an Orton effect or I'm going to dodge and burn. So I'm going to add a new dodge and burn layer, except I'm going to be putting it on its own layer so I can do it non-destructively. I'm going to press Command or Control Shift and N to create a new layer dialog box. I'm going to name this DB for dodge and burn. Blending mode from normal down here to overlay. Check fill with neutral overlay color and click OK. Now I'm going to grab my dodge tool by pressing O on my keyboard and making sure my DB layer is selected. I'm going to keep my range in midtones and my exposure just set to 5, and I'm just going to lighten up some of this foam here and some of this area around the corner. So I'm just dragging around and painting in and dodging this area over here. I'm also going to go into my range and just change my range from midtones to shadows, and so now I can be lightening my shadows a little better. And so I'm just going to lighten up some of her forehead here a little bit, and then particularly around her cheek and stuff, so turning that on and off just to see what's going on there. I like what we're doing. And I'm going to now just change to my burn tool, and this time I'm going to leave it at midtones and my exposure to 10% just to make it a little bit darker there. And I'm going to just darken her bathing suit a bit. And then I might also just darken her hair. Again, just sort of adding that nice soft contrast. And then I also could darken some of these bubbles in here. And then I'm going to go back to my dodge tool, change my range to highlights, and I'm going to maybe lighten up some of these bubbles. So now I'm only affecting those white areas of the bubbles, kind of adding a bit of contrast around them. Now I'll turn this on and off, and we can see the difference that we've made. That's with no dodge and burn, that's with dodge and burn. It kind of just helps to draw the eye exactly where you want it. It kind of dials in the lighting and whatnot in your photo. Next is I could add the Orton effect, which is just like a blur kind of thing, but I'm not going to in this case just because I want to keep this sharp look. And the Orton effect kind of adds like this magical glow looking thing over top. If you're interested in that effect, again, we'll add a link down in the description below to a tutorial where I share that effect. But in this image, I'm not going to do it. So I'm now just going to go onto my final step of sharpening. So I'm going to shift click all my layers. I'm going to press Command Alt Shift and E, and that duplicates and merges all those selected layers. And so I'm going to call this to sharpen. And I'm going to go first up to filter, down here to other, and then go to high pass. I don't want to put my pixel radius up at something really high because then our sharpness will look really intense and horrible. We want to have something very subtle, so about 0.6 to 0.8 is usually the radius that I like to pick for sharpening my photos, but you can find a range that works for you. I'm going to click OK and change my layer blending mode from normal down here to linear light. And now zooming in, if I turn this sharpen layer on and off, you can see it makes quite a difference in how sharp our image is looking. So we're only going to want to sharpen some areas. We're not going to want to sharpen every area in our photo. So I'm going to add a layer mask to this, and I'm going to press Command or Control I on that layer mask to invert it. So now nothing is being affected by the sharpening layer at the moment. I'm going to grab my brush tool, switch my foreground color to white, and I'm going to just sharpen around some of the key areas on her face. So like her lips, we're going to sharpen around. And I might actually just bring down the fill of the sharpening just a little so it's not so aggressive. That looks a little better there. And I'm going to go around her eyelashes here, her eyebrows, maybe along some of her hair. And then I'm also going to maybe sharpen up some of these bubbles. I like what's going on with these bubbles in the like right around her neck and stuff. But of course, there's no point of sharpening a bubble if it's already blurred out. We can only really sharpen things that are in focus. So that looks pretty good there. Turning that on and off, you can't really tell too much of a difference from being zoomed out, but zooming in, it really just sort of makes things pop a little bit more. Makes the certain areas that we want to draw attention to pop a little better. Now, one thing that you should always consider when you're editing a portrait is what do their eyes look like? In this case, there's a really nice eye light, so there's lots going on in her eyes that look very lifelike, but sometimes if they're too dark, you might have to add something into their eyes. In this case, we don't have to do that, which is really nice. And so I'm going to press Command or Control 0, zoom out, and so we've pretty much completed our image now. So I'm going to just group all of these top layers here, press Command or Control G to group them, and I'm going to call these ones to adjustments. So this is how all of my projects look. I have a group for all of my adjustments. If I have any specific things to my photo, like frequency separation, that will be in its own group. And then anything with cutting out the images or adding something in or whatever, that's going to be all done in my breakdown group. And so now I just brought in our original image here with no edits on it. So I'm just going to turn those on and off so you can see the before and after of our edit. So as you can see, we've made our image a whole lot softer. We've kind of accentuated that natural light of the dark and the light. We have touched up her skin, made her skin a little less blotchy. We kind of blended in and adjusted any of those discolorations that was going on in her chin. We did a bunch of sharpening and we did a bunch of cool color adjustments just very subtly that all added up to a really noticeable difference, as you can see here. So that is all I have for you for today. We covered a whole bunch of really cool, unique tools that I have maybe talked about on this channel before. Some of them I have not, but either way, we have now actually gone and applied these techniques into an actual image. We're not just learning about the technique and what it is, we're learning about the technique and how to actually apply it onto our photo. Now, this is a video series that I would like to continue to create, of course, if you guys enjoyed it. So if you did enjoy it, again, please leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on this, or just leave a like, because that will also do as well. If you want to be a part of this video series, I'll leave all that information down in the description below, so you can send me your photos that you would potentially like to see in one of these videos. So with that is all I have for you for today. Again, my name is Brendan from BeWellCreative.com, and I hope to catch you back here next time.